Hello, today we'll be talking about Pan's Labyrinth, and the first thing we'll be discussing is the acting in the script. So what are you guys' thoughts on that?
I thought the script was really interesting, like just the way he kind of was paralleling like what was happening to her in like this fantasy world with like what was happening after I think it was like the Spanish Civil War. Like when I looked it up, it had said a bunch of like that it was an allegory for war, I think.
I think it's World War II. One or two.
Oh, oh yeah. Yeah, but just then like the characters he created, like the I think his name was like the Pale Man, like how he was like kind of a metaphor for the rich people, like how they couldn't really take anything from his plate, like even something small. Like as soon as she did that, like he tried to like kill her.
Yeah, I thought in particular I'm forgetting his name, but the stepfather of Ophelia, his acting was really good because I really disliked him throughout the whole movie because he was just so like cold towards the mother of his child, like his stepchild, and it was terrible.
Yeah, definitely. And it was like as soon as he came on screen, he was acting like that. So it's like right after that, you knew what kind of like villain he was gonna be in this like fairy tale she had.
I
Yeah, I
feel
agree.
like, oh, you can go ahead.
Okay. I was just gonna say the script was really interesting just because like you can tell it was so detailed and intricate, and the script writers and the director and everybody um definitely took their time with this film, and it already is just a long movie. Like it's I think about 2 hours or a little over 2 hours. And just in that time, like there was so many ups and downs and different plots and so much within the actual script that you can tell it was very strategic.
For like a good like majority of the movie, I was pretty confused on what was happening, considering like there was so many different like things going on, like with I think it was the underworld area. Like I was confused as to where that came into play, but I think that the script writers did a really good job at incorporating like all the different parts in a way that made sense. Like it wasn't just random. Like it all had like a purpose.
I think
Yeah.
that
I was
uh,
like, go ahead.
to add to that, I like that because a lot of times when we hear about mythological creatures, not all of them are able to communicate like in a way we understand. And I think the writers made it evidently clear that their communication was really with Ophelia, yeah, and like she could understand them, she could see them, you know, that was her. It was her underworld. She was a princess, quote unquote. So yeah.
Yeah, when I had like watched this movie in high school, it was because our teacher had like our English teacher was talking about magical realism. And so just like watching that, like how you couldn't really tell if like this is something she was kind of making up because like the stepdad couldn't see it and like, it really could just be her like processing trauma. And then like especially at the end, like you can't tell if it's like if like this was kind of like her afterlife or if it was um like I don't even know. Like it was crazy how like he had combined the two, but like still kind of like it was confusing for a while, but like at the end it all kind of like made sense. So yeah, I thought that was really, really good. Also with like the acting though, like when I had been looking up the like people who played the characters, like the person who played Pale Man and the guy who played the Fawn are like the same person, and he's actually like American. Like he had to like learn Spanish for the role, and so I think it like just knowing that those two are played by like the same person, like it almost kind of felt, or I don't know if it was like intentional, if it was just like he could only find one person that kind of would fit into this role. But just like the acting that he was doing, how he kind of embodied those two different characters, I thought was really cool.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Consider like the Fawn and the Pale Man are kind of like two opposites in terms of their places in the underworld. So
Yeah, definitely.
and I guess if nobody else has any other thoughts on that, we can move on to the camera work and the editing.
In terms of the camera work and editing, I liked the flips between the underworld and the real world, I guess. Yeah, I like the flips between, like, some of them seemed very natural and some of them were just like a quick switch. And sometimes it would throw me for a loop. But yeah, I really liked how the cameraman did it, or the editor.
Yeah, going off of that, like with the when she was escaping the Pale Man and how like just how stressful it scene was, and then when she's like going up out of it into the like real world, how they kind of stitch that together. Like it kind of reminded me of like Coraline, and I just thought it was just like,
Yeah, I agree. It gave like it definitely was similar to Coraline in the fact that I don't know, maybe I'd like to look into that and see if Coraline was inspired or whichever one came first. But I was thinking the same thing as watching it, just like only her being able to see what was going on in that world or dimension or whatever. And then like having a strong maternal figure, just like how it was in Coraline. I think that is a cool similarity between the two. And with the editing in the film, like it was very dark and like the actual filters that were used within the film made it very gloomy and just like kind of gave a negative energy throughout the whole film. So it was always like gray and gloomy. And I think that was intentional, of course, by the directors and the screenwriters to give that dark fantasy type of vibe.
yeah, I think the like you're saying, like the how saturated all the colors were, like even when it wasn't, like even when the movie was first starting and it was in like this like kind of nicer, like it was like light out and everything, like the colors were just super like vibrant, almost in like a fake way. It just kind of, yeah, it just kind of felt like it was just a really dark like kids movie, like, and
Exactly.
then yeah, and then people would just be getting like shot, and it's just wild. It was like really disturbing.
It reminds you of like a fairy tale, but just like turned down all the way.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. I think the what stood out to me as well was how it was mainly Ophelia who was the only one interacting with the underground world, and she was the only one who could see like the fairies and who saw the importance of like the magical root. And this kind of touches back on the acting, but I really like the scene where the mom was telling her like, oh, after she burned the magical root, when she was like, magic isn't real, you're starting to grow up, you need to learn that like the real world is hard. And so I think that kind of played into trying to decipher if this whole thing is real or if it's just something that she's used to cope, like I said before.
Yeah, that scene was crazy. Like just his entire, like the director's entire like depiction of birth, I feel like, or like the birth process, like even when she had opened the book and it was like showed like a bloody uterus, and it showed that her mom was like having problems, and when she walked out her mom looked like terrifying. Like it was just really like unsettling. Like I feel like birth isn't usually depicted like that, especially not in a kids movie. Or I mean, this definitely wasn't a kids movie, but not in a movie with like a kid is dealing with it.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely, it was kind of like the whole movie was kind of gory while still maintaining like the magical element of like a fantasy story or something.
For sure.
Okay, if nobody else has anything to say on camera work and editing, we can move on to costumes and missing scenes. For me, I feel like the costumes are kind of like, I don't know, you can tell it's reflective of the time period that it took place in. Like they're in the middle of war. So the clothing was kind of bland, except for when they were in like the underworld, at least the last scene when they were in this like kingdom. That was like the most glamorous that anybody looked in the movie.
Yeah, and even that scene where her mom had gotten her like a dress and she was like so proud of it because it was like a nicer dress than she usually had. And like she got it dirty or just didn't, I mean, she like obviously understood the significance of it being dirty, but just how she kind of even wore it out in the first place, out into the woods, like with her new shoes on. Like, I felt like it was kind of like mirroring how she didn't take the world that seriously yet. Like how her mom kept being like, you need to, grow up, like you need to understand how this stuff works. Like you need to call this man dad so that he feels more like, more affection towards you. And how Ophelia like really didn't get that. And so I think it was shown with like just kind of little things like that.
Yeah, I agree. That was, the dress was a significant, I guess it was like you said, kind of a used as a symbol of her not conforming to the life that's been given to her. Because ever since like her biological dad died, she was not assimilating well into her new life and was kind of rejecting it at every point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to the point that maybe she was even like hallucinating this entire world. Like we don't really know what he was going for with that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like the missing scene that was in the underworld that she went to, her fantasy world, it was like obviously super important. And like when you're thinking of what mise en scene means, and it's like everything that's within the camera, like the scene with the, I don't even know what he was, but it was like a skin man with like the eyes in his hands or whatever. That stuck out to me. And it was just like a overload of props and everything within the actual camera. And just pausing and taking my time looking at the scene, like paying attention to everything that was within the frame, really just like made me appreciate how much thought and effort was put into each shot. And even like the more calm scenes, like just with like the generals and them being like in the up in the actual real world, like everything was just so strategic, and it all aided within the film, like little potion bottles laying around and different papers and other little trinkets and stuff that like relate to the underground. It was all very intentional.
Yeah, and I don't know if this counts as like costumes, but the makeup that they had, like the when Mercedes had like cut his face, like that was like when he pulled his hand away and you saw it afterward, like it was just very like graphic. Like I feel like a lot of this movie was just very like graphic and having it contrast against like the kind of like light mystical world of like Ophelia's little like fantasy stuff. It just made it feel even more like just like violent.
I also, I'm, I would consider it costume, but even like the creatures in the fantasy were like the fairy, you know, in our head you'd imagine a fairy with clothes, and I think the fact that all these creatures were like earthly, just they just look of earth and stuff, which you also expect in fantasy creatures, but you know, I think it gave a more raw feeling to the movie. Like they weren't holding back. It was just, it wasn't child's play is really what I got from it. It wasn't a fantasy world for children. It was like this developed fantasy world that Ophelia had. Like above her age, I don't know. That's what
Yeah, I agree on the fairy parts. When I was watching, I didn't even really, it didn't seem like fairies to me either, because when I think of a fairy, it's kind of like bright colors. Like the fairies they had, it kind of looked, they even looked a little bit scary, because it was just, they didn't look very like, I don't know the word, like jolly, or it just wasn't what you're used to seeing from like fairies in typical movies.
Yeah, and the fact that they started off as like those bugs, like I don't even know how she was like interacting with them to begin with.
Yeah, because I could see from the subtitles they were referring to it as a fairy, but I didn't even realize it until like the scene where they like transformed into what they were. So I was like, it looked more like a bug than a fairy.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, and if nobody has any other thoughts, we can move on to the music.
Well, just like the music in that scene where he was like with the pale man, like where there were all those like paintings and shoes and stuff. That was in like the Maison scene. Like you could also kind of hear like children screaming in the background. And so I feel like there were just a lot of little like haunting touches like that, where it was like the music wasn't even that crazy. Like it was kind of just like going along with whatever the mood was. But all the little like extra stuff they put in there like really made it feel more sinister.
Yeah, I agree. The music didn't really stand out that much. It just kind of flowed with the general sense of the movie. I think the only time it really stood out was on that scene with the pale man where she was like trying to draw the door to get away from him. So I remember that was like a really intense moment in the movie. And I feel like it would get silent. Like when she first went down to get the magical root with the key, it was kind of silent. Like she was just observing everything. You could see like the pictures of the pale man eating these children.
Yeah, and even like I didn't really in that scene notice the music until like she turned towards the food and the music got kind of like it felt like something bad was gonna happen, and it was right before she was trying to eat like the grapes. And yeah, it was like it was really subtle, but it was enough to like kind of put you on edge.
Yep. And lastly, we can talk about the overall psychological impact of the film.
I think it did a really good job of depicting like the cruelty of like the man in charge. And even when they were talking about like, when they were in the rebel camp and they were reading like the newspaper, like the Gauss stutter was reading the newspaper, he was talking about how like American, British, and Canadian forces had like sent troops to support like the government to help hunt down like all these rebels. Um, and so it was just kind of like, I feel like the director was kind of trying to say something with that, even if it was like minor. Like the whole movie just felt kind of like anti like Spanish government, even if it was like a long time ago that he's referring to.
Yeah, I definitely agree that cruelty was a big theme, especially a scene that stuck out to me was when the military man who was in charge, when they caught those two men who were hunting and they got accused of being like for the opposite side of the war, and they got killed for essentially nothing because they really were telling the truth. They kind of showed how harsh the reality is, and it kind of makes you understand why Ophelia would hang on to this childhood story, because it's a lot going on and a lot to take in for a child.
Yeah, and I think it was like interesting. Even the main plot of the movie, like focusing on the Spanish side of World War II. Like when we think of World War II, we're thinking of Germany and the French and stuff like that. So to have this different perspective, all in the form of being a coming of age movie. Also, like really emphasize like just how different this story was and its uniqueness with everything else that was going on, and like the extremity of all the all the violence and everything that her own stepfather was doing. I think it did a really good job of like touching on many different parts of like the psyche.
Yeah, I think the scene with the pale man and how like how essentially why he came and attacked her was because she ate the food, and how what was his name, the man that was in charge of the other girl, I think it was the foe or something, how he warned her you basically can't eat the food down there. And it was kind of an interesting dichotomy because there was all of this food on this big table, where in the real world that people are surviving off of rations, and where it's like one ration per family. So that was interesting to me as well.
Yeah, and even like when they were talking about rationing them down to one, like how they're all up there like eating this like extravagant meal. Like I feel like other than that, like I feel like every scene kind of had like every scene in like the real world kind of had like a fairy tale like underworld equivalent, like how that scene where they're talking about the rationing is kind of similar like to the Pale Man's scene, and like how at the beginning of the movie like the main issue is how this birth is or how this pregnancy is starting to become like a problem, and it takes her to that tree where like that frog is living inside of it, like killing it. So yeah, and then like at the end how she kind of like rebelled against the fawn, and that's how she ended up like going on to her like princess life, and like the rebellion was happening at the same time.
Yeah, that is interesting. I didn't even really notice that when I watched it, but it is kind of like a parallel of the world. But then it was kind of sad at the end because it was kind of like you don't even know if what she's experiencing is just made up or if it's real. Because to the real world, when Mercedes came and she saw her lying on the floor, presumably dead, it was kind of like a switch where you went from being happy because she's in this kingdom to being sad because you're realizing like she's dead, or you don't know really is left in the air at the end.
Yeah, I feel like they kind of played with the idea of like what it means to like get what you want. Cause like she had wanted to go to this place, like to be able to live in this like beautiful world without like her problems. And she was able to, but like she died at the end. And like same with the rebels, like they were able to like overthrow him at the end, but like it cost them so many like people and like the doctor died. And so it was just like there was such a high cost for like kind of what felt like not enough payoff because even the doctor was like, even if you kill him, like they're just gonna send another one. Like it was kind of just minor victories, but it's what they've been working towards the entire movie.
And I think it's always like very telling when the director starts the movie with the death of the main character because it you know gave us something to look forward to. You could say the entirety of the movie, like we knew what was going to happen, but we just didn't know how. And personally, like after seeing her toying back and forth with like this underworld and this deep and dark place, like I had a feeling it was something from that realm that would be the cause of her death. But then you get to the end of the movie and you see that somebody from her own dimension, when she was doing all this traveling to the underworld, was the one who was actually responsible for the end of her life. So it's interesting that like the stigmas and stuff that are held about the underworld and things like that in the movie was definitely combated. And I feel like that was intentional from the author or the director.
Yeah, I don't want to stray too much, but I definitely agree with that. Um, and I thought that was a very good point that the director or the writer made, because you would have automatically assumed it would have had something to do with the underworld. But I think it shows that like the real world is just as bad or even worse, and people in general just can be really bad.
Exactly. I think that's basically one of the main points, if not the main point of the film.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think it was really significant that no matter, like it seemed like Ophelia was struggling in both the real world and the underworld, just trying to find a sense of peace in the whole thing. So that's why the end is so significant, because you don't even know whether to be happy or sad, because like you don't know which fate is better. But does anyone have any last thoughts before we wrap it up? Okay. Okay, that's the end of our podcast. Thank you for listening.